Matt and I are joined by Cam Battley, who's Senior VP of Aurora Cannabis Inc., and Jodie Emery, the Princess of Pot herself and owner of Cannabis Culture. We are, of course, talking about the federal report that was just released yesterday on marijuana and how we should go about regulating it and how we should go about, I guess, legalizing it in the future. Cam, one thing that stuck out to me here was the fact that, and I mean to both of you, Jodie and Cam, is that the Prime Minister himself has gone out of his way to say that he's not doing this to appease recreational smokers. The Public Safety Minister, Ralph Goodell, came out and said that officers still have to enforce the law. Where do you expect we go from here in this interim period, I suppose?
Okay, so a couple of things. I take the Prime Minister at his word when he says that he's doing this for reasons of good public policy. And I think there's a lot of courage in what he's doing and what Canada is doing, leading the world. The next point is, what should we be doing about the criminalization of cannabis? And too many people have been busted, have developed criminal records because of possession of cannabis and association with it. So I think it would be smart for us to move in the direction of decriminalization.
And Jodie, I mean, on that point, one of the interesting issues, one of the things that we have heard already is the government saying they kind of are open to the idea of possibly looking at pardons for previous offenses, but that hasn't actually been addressed in a coherent way, and it hasn't been addressed as kind of part of the overall package of what they're rolling out here. They were asked the question, and they gave kind of a half-hearted answer.
Well, Trudeau actually doesn't answer the question anymore, even when Mulcair grills him about how criminal records are harming young people. And so how is legalization going to protect them when they're still being arrested? And it's very disappointing because Trudeau years ago was against legalization, but for decriminalization, saying that it cost society too much, it hurt young people, and even his own late brother had suffered from marijuana prohibition arrest. So for him to just abandon decriminalization in favor of political partisan attacks, it's irresponsible and it's unjust. Justin Trudeau himself is a hypocrite. He admits to smoking pot, trafficking pot by passing a joint. My husband, Mark Emery, spent 3 months in jail for passing a joint. Trudeau admits to doing the very same crime as a member of parliament. So when he's talking about we're not going to legalize it to please the recreational consumer, who is he legalizing it for?
Yeah.
That's what I want to know. If it's not to please the consumer, well, then he's really turning his back on the millions of people who voted for him in the election based on this issue.
That, Cam, is such an interesting issue because Jodie's absolutely right. I mean, the Prime Minister has said repeatedly, I'm not doing it for the recreational users. You and I have spoken before because you're from the medicinal cannabis side of the industry. As Jodie has said, it's not a perfect system, but it exists. It's been worked on. You've been part of it. If you're not doing it for the recreational user, and if you already have an imperfect but developing medicinal sector, I'm at a loss to imagine why the Liberals are doing this then.
At some point, I don't really care what their motivations are. They're doing the right thing. Let's focus on the big picture here. This report from the task force is substantially remarkable. The fact that we are the first developed country in the world that is moving toward true legalization of cannabis and taking the criminal law enforcement element out of it, this is remarkable. This is something that we should be delighted about. It's an area of Canadian leadership. And this report is very impressive. It's not perfect, but it's darned good.
However, the government, Anne McClellan, did say in her announcement yesterday that the government would be giving more money to police to go after people operating outside the legal system. Mm-hmm. So one of the arguments for legalization was to reduce the many hundreds of millions of dollars. And that money is still being wasted. And the government has said, continue enforcing the law.
Well, let's talk about the enforcement for a little bit here, because when we're talking about, one thing that the report left out, rather, was talking about how we're going to deal with those who are discovered to be impaired under the influence while driving, saying that it's an incomplete system. All the evidence isn't necessarily there to develop how we're going to go about doing this. Jodie, let me ask you, because I think you've been quoted in the past as saying you don't think it actually makes a difference whether or not you're impaired under the influence of cannabis while driving.
Yeah, Cannabis Culture has been published for 2 decades, and we have more than 2 decades of studies out of the UK, Australia, Canada, the United States, including the recent National Highway Traffic Safety Administration from the U.S. government, where they said marijuana users are no more likely to crash than straight drivers. And so when we're talking about impaired driving, do not drive impaired. That includes pharmaceutical drugs that say do not operate heavy machinery or drive. And you have to drive safely no matter whether you're tired, whether you're angry. There's all sorts of ways that can impair your driving. But when we start trying to draw people's blood or saliva and trying to hunt down THC in their system to say, you're a bad driver because you're a cannabis user. That's not fair. Impairment is proven by performance. So if you're driving dangerously, whatever the cause, police can pull you over for driving dangerously. But once they try and just sniff out weed or try and prove that you smoked it maybe within the last month, that's not accurate. And even the U.S. Automobile Association, I believe it was, they said that these tests are not accurate. They wrongly condemn people who are not driving impaired, and it actually doesn't even accurately test for those who are impaired.
Running down a bit of a checklist about what the government has actually said here. Here's some of the high points. The minimum age for purchase would be 18. There would be a preference to avoid selling alcohol and cannabis at the same location. The density and location of storefronts would be managed, including proximity to areas frequented by children. Retail sales would be regulated at the provincial or territorial level, not at the federal. And here is one, Cam, that you'd mentioned, and Jodie, I think you were eager on it as well. Restrict the promotion and advertising of cannabis products in step with existing restrictions on tobacco advertising. Cam, I'm not a marijuana user, but my gut feeling had always been the appropriate regulation would be more like my preferred drug, alcohol, rather than as tobacco.
Yeah, I think Jodie and I agree about this. I have a difficulty with that particular recommendation. I do think that cannabis advertising, promotion, branding should be regulated very much the same way that alcohol is. And there are a lot of good reasons for that. First of all, if you do want to start to eliminate the black market, giving branding availability to the legitimate players is one step that you want to take. Also, there's a lot to learn about cannabis, and you want people to be well educated about what they're using, what products they're using, what the effects are likely to be. So that kind of branding, promotion, advertising, information availability is going to be critical, particularly at the very beginning of this.
Jodie, there's been a lot of talk and a lot of hints from the Liberals that the dispensary system will effectively be shut down once this legislation comes to fruition. What's your reaction to that, given that so many dispensary owners have, in fact, been on the front lines of moving this conversation forward?
It's really upsetting that the government is looking to criminalize and punish the pioneers of this industry. The only reason we have legal medical marijuana in this country, the only reason we have any reform for marijuana, is because victims of prohibition, dispensary operators, growers, patients, got arrested, got punished, went to court and won, and the court ordered the government to provide access. So these pioneers who actually laid the groundwork for legalization should not be frozen out. They shouldn't be demonized, but they are. And we're hearing a narrative from the government about safe, legal, licensed producer weed versus dangerous, deadly dispensary weed, even as far as Premier Christy Clark of British Columbia lying about fentanyl being in weed and the police saying that's not true. So the government, remember, has spent billions of dollars over many decades persecuting millions of Canadians, stigmatizing them, demonizing them, taking away their right to travel, taking away their kids, their jobs. And this has all been based on the idea that marijuana is harmful. So now that we're legalizing it, which should be about civil liberties, about how prohibition has harmed people more than the substance itself, we need the government to admit that they were wrong. But they don't want to do that. What government wants to admit that they unjustly criminalized and punished 500,000 Canadian citizens for a peaceful activity? So they need to keep saying marijuana is dangerous, marijuana is harmful, be afraid, even though we have decades of science and evidence and just anecdotal evidence of looking around that marijuana is not a crisis, it's not a problem, but the government wants to make it seem scary so they can continue to regulate it in a bad way.
Guys, we've run out the clock here, but we're going to give the last word to Will, who's listening right now, who's proposed a new set of terminology: Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Millennial, Gen Stoned. I have met a few millennials and boomers in my time. I don't think this would be the first Gen Stoned, but I think it's terminology we consider at the very least. Jodie, Emery, Cam Battley, thanks so much, guys. Really appreciate you coming in.